Aloha, selamat pagi, namaste, shalom. Wherever you are in the world today, we're so glad you're here with us and sending you love from Singapore. Welcome to the fourth day of the ABPN Virtual Conference with the theme of philanthropy. Philanthropy means love of humanity and lies at the heart of human greatness. Our session now is Funding Systems Change in Asia. What can donors and doers learn from each other? If you had attended our earlier session on day 2, Scaling Impact in Collaborative Philanthropy, Dipali Khanna from the Rockefeller Foundation said that systems change is like an elephant. No one can see the whole elephant, so we need to collaborate. What better way to collaborate than to learn from each other? I am Dorothy Cheng, your friendly ABPN host for this session and the shortest one on the ABPN team. But you know what they say, God only lets things grow until they are perfect. Some of us didn't take as long as others. ABPN is the largest network for philanthropists and social investors in Asia. Our mission is to move capital towards impact to build a better world for you, me, and our future generation. Even as we enter the fourth day of the conference, we continue to share exciting daily highlights live on social media. So don't forget to share your experience with us by using the hashtag ABPN2020. A few housekeeping announcements before we start the program. If you get disconnected or have a bad connection, try logging in and out of the app. Close all other programs running in the background. Please note that this session will be recorded. You will be able to access the recording later on the ABPN conference website. There's a committee chat box in this room. Feel free to introduce yourself and meet other delegates that are here. There will be an audience Q&A towards the end. Do type your questions in the Q&A pod. We also have a resource pod here. Feel free to access the materials that are listed. I will now introduce you to our lovely moderator. Tim Hangstad is the CEO of the Chandler Foundation and a Skoll Social Entrepreneur Awardee. In the name of systems change, Tim once said, "Laws do matter, but if we are to change the world, we have to change the rules." Let's change the world. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Dorothy, and good morning to everyone in Asia and to all of you attending from the rest of the world. I want to thank ABPN. I'm excited about this session. Our goal is to have an honest, unfiltered conversation about funding systems change in Asia. And I think we're going to learn from each other. I think we're going to perhaps come away with some new insights from our terrific panel, and maybe even change our points of view about certain things. Our session is going to run about an hour. At a high level, it will include some audience polls, so get ready, you're going to be polled. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions that I'll be asking the panelists. We have a terrific panel. I'm going to quickly introduce them. We have Neera Nundy. Neera is based in Mumbai. She is the co-founder and partner at Doers, which is catalyzing India's strategic philanthropy movement. Neera and Doers play a crucial role in bringing capacity building, knowledge, and funding and networks to the sector. Neera holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. She is an Indian Leadership Initiative Fellow with the Aspen Institute. And while Neera has lived in Mumbai for 21 years, she is Canadian-born. She co-founded Doers together with her husband, Deval, and they are also very busy raising 3 feminists who also happen all to be teenage boys. So great to have you with us, Neera. Next, I want to move to Iqbal Dhaliwal. Iqbal is the Global Executive Director of JPAL, a center that began at MIT and Cambridge and now has offices around the world. JPAL promotes the use of rigorous evidence in social policy. His JPAL colleagues Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee were awarded the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. Iqbal's life and career started in India, where he served in India's premier civil service, and I understand he secured first rank among more than 300,000 college graduates in the National Civil Services exam. Very impressive. He has graduate degrees from Delhi School of Economics and Princeton, and although you might never know it from what he does now, Iqbal was once big on horseback riding and show jumping. Next, we have Rukmini Banerjee. Rukmini is the CEO of Pratham, a leading and award-winning educational NGO in India. Rukmini joined Pratham in 1996 after working in philanthropy. She has extensive field experience in program implementation and research. Rukmini initially trained as an economist. She also attended the Delhi School of Economics. Was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University and earned her PhD at the University of Chicago. Originally from Bihar, she now makes her home in New Delhi, where she loves telling and writing stories for her children. And last but not least, we have James Chen. James is a Hong Kong-based philanthropist, business leader, and social entrepreneur. He's a chairman of his family's enterprise. He's an early adopter of venture philanthropy with his family's foundation. He's also the founder of Clearly, a global campaign aiming to bring clear vision to 2.5 billion people. Very ambitious goals. James tells me he has the drive and enthusiasm of a 30-year-old, but he is trapped in a 58-year-old body. And I know exactly what that feels like. So, before we jump into questions for the panelists, and since you've gotten to know them a bit, we want to know you as the audience. So we have a question for you. Are you a doer or a donor? So please select whether your current primary day job is primarily in the doer world or primarily in the donor world. And if it's equally in both, you can answer both. So let's see who we have in the audience here. Looks like more doers than donors. Yeah, I'm seeing about 48% doers, 20% donors, and the remainder marking both. Thanks. Well, it's good to get an idea of who's out there in the audience. Well, let's move to the questions. Let's move to the first round of questions, if we can, please. And I'm going to start with Neera. Neera, your work at Doers is unique and impressive, catalyzing India's strategic philanthropy movement. And I know you do that, as I understand it, around the 3 C's, creating knowledge, providing capacity, and by building collaboration. And with your work with numerous donors in India, I'm sure you find that not all of them have an appetite for funding systems change. Could you tell us, like, what are some of the common causes that funders maybe aren't interested in funding systems change?
So thank you, Tim, and thank you, Nana and the team for having all of us. And I'm actually looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists as well. But yes, I mean, great question. I think what's exciting is that there seems to be more and more momentum around systems change. Maybe not a whole lot of understanding around it, but at least there's more enthusiasm to want to participate, I think, both on the donor and the doer. I might need to just caveat that, as you explained what Doers does, we kind of sit in the middle. So we find ourselves being a bridge between where the funding is and where sort of the impact's ultimately landing. I think one of our biggest challenges to pursue systems change, and I think what I'll say is probably quite obvious, is complexity. And Tim, I was just reading Chandler's report there. Something said embracing complexity. And I think that's one of our challenges, is that because of the complexity to have systems change deliver on impact, we often, as both doers and donors, shy away from that complexity. So I think it's because you need a number of different pieces that are coming in to support the system, and then as the system sort of chugs along, it starts to hopefully spit out impact. I think sometimes it looks like it's a big black box, and so when I'm putting into the box or taking out from the box, I think the complexity inside there needs to be deconstructed, therefore simplified. So it's not complicated, it's complex, right? So the more we push to simplify, I feel that that will engage donors. I actually think doers get it. So it looks like most of the folks on this call are doers. So I think that part of our second challenge, so complexity, second one is attribution. So donors want to take credit for things, or maybe they have to report to some level of accountability, but it's very difficult for that linear kind of association. So direct attribution becomes difficult or frankly very expensive, right, to be doing. And then you have to let go a bit of that control. And I'm sure Iqbal will talk about this a bit. And so I have complexity, attribution, and the last thing really being measurability, which is a little bit around the attribution piece, is that you want to be able to measure quickly to be able to justify all the work that you're doing on the doer side or the money that you're giving. And there's a time lag in that. And some of the indicators are not always proximate to how you might ultimately design. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences of systems change that I think it's still in its nascency. So although as a field, I believe it's quite advanced and sophisticated and a lot of people study it, I think its application is really the journey we're on.
Great, thanks, Neera. That was a great response. And you mentioned measurability. I want to turn to Iqbal. Iqbal Jaypal does such great work, but maybe if you could start just by telling us a little bit about that work, and then address maybe the measurability point that Neera raised, and how do you think about measurability as at least a potential barrier to thinking about systems change?
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim, for having me, and to ABPN for having me and for this great panel. Really look forward to learning a lot today. Yeah, so I think one of the main things and the foundations on which Jaypal was founded was this belief that we all have instincts and ideology and inertia, and based on that, there's a lot of decision making, whether it is at the level of the governments, whether it is at the level of the NGOs as doers, or it is at the level of foundations and other organizations as donors, is driven by our instincts, ideology, and inertia. And that, after decades and decades, hasn't led to the sort of measurable impact on poverty and development that we would like to see. And so what, our basic premise is to base decision making on evidence and data. And the way we like to do that is to go into the field, work with implementation partners and doers like Rukmini Banerjee and Pratham, one of the first organizations that Jaypal worked with. Work with them to first and foremost measure what the problem is. I think oftentimes we jump into trying to measure what the impact of our innovations are, but sometimes it's very important to measure, are we actually understanding the context well? Are we understanding the extent of the problem? And then that also helps you understand what the drivers of this problem are. Once you have a handle on that, you can either map it to what you know is existing evidence, which is something like we love to do rather than jumping into a new innovation, or work to innovate in tandem with the partner. So again, sticking to the example of Pratham, Pratham has been at the forefront of trying to measure the impact, measure the extent of the problem through USR and other surveys. Jaypal was able to come work with them to evaluate some of the innovative design things that they were thinking about, which is basically redoing the classroom according to the ability of the students, and then measure that in a way that not only gives confidence to Pratham as an organization, but also gives confidence to the donor side that when the results of these studies are coming out based on randomized evaluations, which is what we do, donors can have the confidence that now doers like Rukmini are basing this based on hard evidence done by an independent organization rather than their instincts, ideology, or inertia. And so I think we see this as the second most important level, like the second stage after understanding the context. And the final thing I would say on measurability is that as you scale up program for system level change, as you go from innovation to scale, and that scale could be either with the existing organization like Pratham or taking it to a different region for system level change, you want to use data and to measure the monitoring systems which are in place to make sure that you are actually delivering on it.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up question, Iqbal. Are you seeing more appetite among doers and donors for this kind of more rigorous evidence? I mean, wanting to measure the impact of their own work.
Absolutely. I think starting with about and I would say it's been the trend for almost about 10 years now. I think a lot of the new philanthropy which emerged from the West Coast of the US, a lot of philanthropy which emerged from organizations like DFID and other multilateral organizations, it really was premised on the fact that we are going to use science and to measure it using that science. And so, at least for the last few years, I would say the demand for some of the work that we have been doing is much more than even our ability to do it. And that's why you see a proliferation of many other organizations in what we call the evidence to policy space. I think some of the work, for instance, that the Chandler Foundation has done in partnership with Co-Impact is a reflection of that evidence-informed policy making. And yes, absolutely, it's a great trend, and we are very confident about it. I think, Tim, one thing I will say is that the application to different sector varies across things. So I think, for instance, in education, in agriculture, in health, you see much more of it. I think there are a few areas, for instance, the one that I would say is the most pressing is climate change. Even though in climate change is one area where I sometimes feel that so much of the conversation is based on evidence and on science, and yet people have formulated opinions, either climate change is a hoax or climate change is real, and therefore sometimes I feel that people feel both sides feel that we don't need any more evidence. And I think that's the area where I really hope to answer your question, that there can be more demand for evidence so that both sides can kind of challenge themselves and put their money onto things that really work.
Great. Thank you. Moving to James. James, you're a great example of a philanthropist who's having a catalytic effect by investing in what is described as the world's largest unmet disability, poor vision. Tell us a bit about that work and whether you see clearly as having a systems change impact. If so, how and what are maybe the keys to that success?
Thanks, Tim. So the Clearly campaign was launched about in 2016, and this is the latest phase of a 15-year journey that I've been on to really understand why the world does not have access to vision correction, and mainly it's people in the developing world. And this has been a very long and tough journey. But with the Clearly campaign, we really believe that it is possible to be able to deliver vision correction to everyone in the world. And so we needed to communicate that, to try and build the coalition. And so far, we've had really three very important, I think, impacts on the system change. First of all, it's the Clearly campaign has been able to unify the messaging within the eye sector to reframe the vision correction issue from the health silo where it was resided, within the minds of policymakers, where it has no priority, when compared to other health interventions such as diseases, acute diseases where people are dying, or things like malnutrition, right? Poor vision is at the bottom of the pile of priorities there. But it's now becoming recognized through the work of the campaign that it is actually something called a Sustainable Development Goal Accelerator. So reframing it from one silo to link it to productivity, education outcomes, and gender equality and so forth really, changes the dynamic and thinking around the issue by policymakers. Secondly, we've had in driving the political advocacy, we've had a couple of really good breakthroughs. First is a acceptance by the Commonwealth Heads of Government Leaders meeting in London in 2018, where they in their final statement, recognize this is an agenda item to be worked on within Commonwealth countries. And secondly is the formation of the Friends of Vision group at the United Nations, where we've already had success in helping to bring the issue of vision correction into the universal healthcare agenda. And this year we're pushing to have this a World Sight Day recognized by the UN, as well as a resolution on vision correction as a basic human right.
That's so great. Thanks, James. Moving to Rukmini, I imagine that most of our audience is aware of Pratham's great work in ensuring all children in India have access to basic education. But do you think of Pratham's work as systems changing work? And if so, what is the system you're changing, and how are you changing it?
Tim, one of the good things about coming last on a panel is that almost anything that needs to be said has been said already. And so I'm going to just move ahead and tell you a little story. I actually don't like the word systems change, because I think the word systems and I think the word change means many different things to many different people. It's a bit like Hinduism. We have millions of gods and we can worship at that and still be called a good worshipper. So I was in the office of a friend who headed one of the biggest departments in a big state called rural development, right? And we were talking, and he said to me, Rukmini, you're very lucky because you have found your tiger. And I asked him to explain, and this was the time in India when there was this big wild life conservation campaign going on. And you would see on the TV and everywhere how many tigers were still alive. And if the number of tigers went up, then it meant that something right was happening in the whole conservation area. And so his point was that by focusing on whether every child in India can read or do simple arithmetic, I had my tiger. And if my tiger went up, then many things that contribute to it presumably got up. And I like that because it makes, like Iqbal said and like Neera said, I think it makes the problem that you're trying to tackle very visible and tangible. And it's important to have the problem be visible and tackleable by everyone, not just by policymakers or by certain planners. But if I really want every child in India to be reading, every parent has to be aware of where my child is at and what I need to do. And so going to Neera's point about complexity and complications, I think there's a big need to bring out ways in which these things can be communicated. That is not to say that the process of change can be just a simple a linear pathway. But get the idea in many, many million people's heads that this is a problem and that we all need to contribute. So to me, the system, or whatever systems, and even the S at the end of systems is, I think, an important letter, because if there are many, many interlocking pieces, and different people may bring them together in different ways. But if your tiger does not change, then all of that is not useful.
Okay, so we need to change our tigers. We have another poll question for our audience. So if the organizers could just bring that up, please. And you can see the question is about what do you perceive as the most important reason why donors might be reluctant to support systems change efforts. So please take 30 seconds or so to answer, and we'll then take a look at the results. Okay, can we close the polling? It looks as if the top answer by far was difficulty in attribution of outcomes. And then we have a tie for second between donors preferring short-term timelines and building the necessary coalitions. Partnerships is overly challenging, and then only about 7% thought that too few investment-ready systems change efforts are readily available. I want to go back to our panelists. Neera, back to you. First of all, looking at these poll results, anything surprise you? Any observations?
Yeah, I mean, even though I'm the one who I'm also convinced that it's the attribution potentially that's a challenge. I think there's something underlying the attribution which has a bit to do with control and power and wanting to feel directly connected with what you're funding. In addition, that then plagues the doer to have to compartmentalize rather than have sort of an outcome-led approach. So I also don't agree that there aren't enough investments, let's say, that have a systems change approach. Now, I think it might be worth distinguishing that, at least from my perspective, I see them as enabling the system, right? They came up with an USER index to enable. Others might be more embedded within a system. So I think it's useful to define what's the approach to systems change. There are very simple ones kind of out there, and there are also enablers, right, for that system to begin to work. And I think it's useful, at least from my perspective, we recognized that there's something to be said of actually enabling organizations and leaders to use the systems change approach because of how they want to be able to implement with that approach, but because the donor is still lagging, that's really where DUS has inserted itself. And so we launched our 10 to 19 Adolescent Collaborative, which focuses on adolescent girls. And what we found is useful, which James said a bit, is placing outcomes at the center. And so you can attribute the fact that if you pool into the Adolescent Collaborative, so it's also a pooled fund, which then also begs the need for how you engage different kinds of donors who frankly are quite siloed, right? Like Iqbal was saying, you know, is it health, is it education? Well, in the outcomes in our Adolescents Collaborative, which has taken us 7 or 8 years to actually get to this point, you know, we have delaying child marriage, delaying first pregnancy, completing secondary school and agency. No one would debate that these are outcomes that will empower an adolescent girl. Now, what people debate is, I have sexual reproductive health. So are you going to achieve sexual reproductive health outcomes that the more we can provide platforms for the funding to be pooled. So we've ended up pooling almost $50 million over the years, of which it enables an individual to participate, it enables an institutional funder to participate, and corporates to participate. So because of the wide gap between, so I believe doers are very advanced. So if we can close that gap with some intermediation, you know, I think that will really help. And I think something else that will help is the openness to course correct. So yes, you can bring a third party and you can do evaluation assessments, and those become very dipstick moments in time and extremely expensive. But if we all agreed that this systems change could actually be relying more on feedback loops, and so the more you enable organizations with that capacity and capability, the more they'll be able to adjust to actually meet ultimately those outcomes. I know that was kind of all over the place, but I got excited with that survey.
But you mentioned something, just a quick follow-up question. You mentioned something about control, which reminded me of also the power dynamic often between donors and doers, which is I've often observed. I mean, I spent 30 plus years on the doer side, and was quite aware of it. How does that get in the way of feedback loops for maybe you say that doers are quite advanced, and it sounds like you're saying more advanced maybe than donors around doing or accelerating systems change. Does that power dynamic get in the way, and if so, what can be done about addressing it so that donors can get better feedback from doers about how to effectively fund systems change?
So I think I should be careful in case I am quoted, that it's a massive generalization, right, to say that all doers are one way and obviously all funders are another. But if I were to break down, let's say, the donor side, they're extremely sophisticated funders. So I would say Gates is a sophisticated funder, Packard, sophisticated funder, Ford Foundation, and so there's institutional money, highly siloed, but very sophisticated. I think they get it. And there's an extreme power dynamic there. But that kind of changes when you start to move to, let's say, family. So we work a lot with individual philanthropists and how they give and how they approach their giving. And there's something to be said about the power dynamic of a program officer and someone who represents money and the actual principal. So the actual philanthropist who created money from wealth, these two actually engage in a funny enough opposite power dynamic. So I think that's really where the challenge becomes, is that if I'm a program officer at a foundation, I'm like, I've been doing sexual reproductive health forever, I'm an expert. But that power dynamic then plays into the leader of the doer who's saying, you know, give me a chance, let me try. Frankly, I believe a lot of the leaders who are implementing and executing are the real experts in this. And so I think being more clear about where you need accountability on the underside to be able to drive the agendas, right? Because the program officer has a whole lot of bureaucracy sitting on top of them, that what leaders of systems change need to do is just carve out pieces for as long as our funders aren't going to figure out how to do it. Figure out what's going to enable them to go and move a systems change agenda requires us also on the doer leader side of implementation to reimagine what that could compartmentalize and downplay slightly the activism that I'm expressing.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for venturing into that. And I didn't mean to say that you had generalized earlier by saying that all doers were ahead of donors. So I just Iqbal, moving to you. Well, first, any comments, observations on the poll?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'm very happy to see that many people think that the binding constraint here is the lack of outcomes. It means that Jaypal and I have been in business for a very long time. So very happy to see that bit. I think my sense is that there is no wrong answer in that poll that you just did. Every single one of the points that you put in that poll, Tim, is kind of a key factor. This is what I often call the what, where, who, when, and how kind of problem of system level change. I think, it is, and to that extent, it is a little bit like climate change. And, to Nita's point earlier, if you see the whole thing as, I want to change the system, the more you dive deeper into it, you get intimidated by the extent of the problem and what you need to do. And what you need to actually do is to break it down into what I call these 5 points. The first one is what to do. And I think that comes down to the point about measuring impact. I want to do something in education. What are the most cost-effective and importantly also cost-effective ways to improve learning outcomes? And I think there, so many people have invested money in getting people computers and digital devices and Wi-Fi connections, when essentially, our work, for instance, with Pratham, of Jaypal and Pratham, is showing that kids are not learning because you're teaching them way beyond their ability. So I think that's the what part, and breaking it down is important. The second part is, where do you want to do it? Like, what makes a particular country, a particular government, or a particular, let's just say, what context makes it more amenable to system level change versus the other? Perhaps the place where you most want to, for instance, do system level change is South Sudan. But maybe South Sudan is not the place where you can actually deliver on system level change. In fact, you might need to go to a country like India or a country like Zambia to do system level change. And that kind of people often find it very hard to grapple with the fact and say, but I want to go to the poorest of the country. So then that brings to the third question, who do you want to do the system level change with? And I think this is where I actually find that a lot of donors have this resistance to work with governments, and there is a sense oftentimes, especially when I go to places like the Silicon Valley, people are like used to the Airbnbs and the Ubers of the world, which cut down the government, and they're like, so why do I need the government? But I think if you want system level change, even if you want it with a fantastic large NGO, those NGOs have to partner with the governments to create enduring change, and I think that becomes a third hurdle. The fourth is when to do it. I think the donors and all of us have to realize that the when is actually not in our hands. So, when you're ready to invest the money may not be the right time to go in, and I think keeping your gunpowder or your ammunition ready for those exact policy windows when there is appetite for system level change is much more important than throwing money at a problem when there is not an appetite. And sorry, but this is a complex question, but then the fifth and the last piece of this is the how piece. How do you do system level change? There are multiple stakeholders involved, there is money involved, and there is the importance of technology, technical advice. So I think I won't go into the answers to all of those in detail, but I think, Tim, it's a complicated problem, and if you break it down into those small pieces, then it's doable.
Thank you. That was great. And your point about sometimes the reluctance to engage with government really resonates. James, moving to you. You have developed a theory of change. I'm just going to ask the organizers to bring up a slide because I think it's quite interesting. It's a theory of change about the role of philanthropic capital, which relates to this topic. And the theory of change, as I understand it, highlights the comparative advantage of philanthropic capital in terms of risk. Could you, this is, it's a fairly, maybe fairly complex, but could you break this down for us in terms of explaining the theory of change and distill, what are the important lessons for donors here from this theory?
Okay. Thank you. First of all, just to respond, on the last poll, right? What it strikes me is that all of those are kind of outcomes or effects of the key issue that people don't seem to really grasp onto, particularly on the donor side, which is risk-taking, right? Risk-taking appetite. And I think that, all the discussion that everyone's had so far, if you pull it all back, it boils down to, are donors willing to be risk takers? Take more risk in your philanthropy, right? Most high net worth made their money being risk takers in business, but somehow when it comes to their philanthropy, they become extremely risk averse. They become like governments and institutions. And that is where I feel very strongly that that is the superpower of private capital, is that, we, as Mira said, she and, yourself, Mira, or if you're a USAID, grants officer, or, institution, even a corporate, grants officer, you're all agents for the capital, right? You're not the owners of capital, whereas donors are the owners of capital, and they need, and we, and myself, and other high net worth donors need to be able to take high risk, right, in their philanthropy, in the same way that the founder of your business enterprise took really high risk to establish that and build the financial wealth, right? So, with this idea of risk in mind, if you look at this chart, right, this is actually, it's very much, if you were in the financial, in the profit-making arena, right, you would instantly recognize this is kind of the life cycle of any idea, right? From idea towards success. At first, on the idea, it's an idea, but you need people to back you with what we now know is called venture capital, right? In the for-profit space, right? Because you're going to be burning cash and trying to prove out those ideas, and very often they fail in the for-profit as well as the non-profit. The key is the ability to learn from those failures, right, and then restart again. I don't know if anyone has had a chance to watch this new documentary that came out about a company called General Magic. That's the name of the documentary, but it talked about the smartphone. Actually, the idea of the smartphone came out in 1989, and it was way too early, and there was lots of failures, and then finally Apple got it right, and now it's like a no-brainer, right? But actually, that no-brainer got its start in 1989, right? And that's what I'm talking about here is, some things will take a shorter, some longer, but you have to go down that point where it's all about burning and risk-taking, right? And then at some point, you come up with a model that says, oh, we have the breakthrough, and then you start to be able to scale. And it's at that point where institutional capital can step up, because they are by nature, because they are representing owners of capital. Those agents, generate more risk averse, and they can then start to scale up by putting their capital at work, right? And so you see phases that in the for-profit space you would call private equity, and ultimately public markets, right? And that's where the scaling up, the governments and for most corporates and frankly today for most private donors are all on the right-hand side of the chart, taking lower risk. They want to take lower risks, but they want to have an impact. Okay, but we're not going to get there unless there's more people taking the left side of the chart, where it's under the x-axis, and that's where I feel very strongly that only private capital, where we're owners of the capital, we can take those risks and deploy that capital, because this is a journey. This is my particular journey, has been 15 years, but along the way, because I'm, have been failing but learning, success, learning, and fail again, learn, success. that's, yeah, I think we're now, have crossed the x-axis, and that's why the Clearly campaign, we're able to then advocate and start to engage with governments in this process, right? So and perhaps if I may use an analogy, right, is that in this concept is that, this is like, seeking risk capital for system change is like being stuck in an ocean looking for fresh water, right? There's lots of water around you, but not to quench your thirst. And actually drinking the seawater will actually harm you, right? So in our world, doers, like sailors in the ocean, have to be realistic and clever to harvest fresh water, because the chance of rain now is very low. If more private donors embrace taking risk, embarking on journeys of system change and building domain expertise, weather will change, the drought will be lifted, with more chances for the doers to survive and thrive with fresh water from the rain. So in other words, the current environment for systems change is dire because of the lack of fresh water, i.e. risk-taking capital, and an overabundance of salt water, i.e. risk-averse capital. Private donors can step up to make more risk-taking capital available, thereby system change the system change.
Wow, that's deep. Thank you. Thank you. We've just got a few minutes left for questions, so I want to tee up some of those questions again, but where are we? Let's see here. Back to Rukmini about, I want a question for you and your experience with donors. What are the best kind of donor practices you see out there that you would like to see more donors undertake? Is it the length of funding? Is it the more flexibility? How could donors act better for Pratham in order to help you accelerate the good work that you're doing?
I think we've had some very good examples early in our life, and I think that at some level spoiled us a little bit, because we have that kind of expectation from anybody that we work with. And I think that the main characteristic that we have found to be very useful is partnership. That whoever is providing the financial resources also thinks of them as an equal partner in this whole journey. And going back to what James has been talking about, the only thing that you can really guarantee, especially in a high-risk context, is learning. And so I think that if you're willing to go as equal partners, you're willing to go through the ups and downs of the risk, you're willing to go with an open mind, and all of that combined, I think, one word if you had to use is to say, we are going to learn what it takes to move forward. I'm not using the word impact, I'm not using the word outcome, because there is a process of discovery about how this journey is going to be. Early in our life, we were funded by Oxfam Novib, who I think laid the foundations for several major initiatives in India, simply by saying that we are together and that we are going to learn from each step. We had the Hewlett Foundation, which was another long-run partner with a very similar attitude. So the multi-year obviously is important, but I think what is more important is that you are tough on each other, but you're together, and that you hold each other kind of intellectually responsible as well as responsible on the ground. Our partnership, for example, with JPAL is something that we decided to do. There was no donor compulsion on us. But I think that partnership also led others to see that these guys are willing to take a very hard look and an honest look at what they're doing, and are fine to even talk about failure. So I think that this deep commitment to learning and a deep commitment to say that we don't know everything, we have to figure it out. And then if we figure it out in one location, it doesn't automatically mean it will work elsewhere. But I think that the value of equal partnership is very, very high. And along with that, you can't have that partnership unless you both want to learn.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Rukmini. There's a question here for Neera about, Neera, could you share from personal experience the approach you took to pool funding from individuals or organizations to multiply impact? What are the one or two key learnings from your journey?
Yeah, so I think I think pooling funds actually just means creating certain vehicles and directing the money. And so what I think has enabled a lot of it is just having that intermediary function to pool. So if someone wants to give directly to a nonprofit that's in the portfolio, you know, they can give to that. If they want to give to the community of practice, they can give to that. If they want to be part of the full platform and the collaborative, which is always harder to raise for, they can give to that. But it's that institutional, more stable, multi-year funding that comes in first, and then you can bring in these kind of curated pieces. So I think thinking about it as the full pie and then breaking down the pieces enables a lot of bringing in folks, but constant communication. Right now we have hundreds of different kinds of reports that have to go out. So there's just a lot of coordination and logistics that at times you wonder, right? Is it really worth having that kind of leakage through the system, right? So you have leakage with us, you have leakage with evaluation, and then by the time it really gets into the community, you know, was it worth it? So I think you have to be able to grow that pie. If that pie wasn't going to be bigger, then you're not worth kind of sitting in the middle of it and taking away. But I know we're, in the interest of time, I did want to end with one thing, Tim, that for systems change to be successful, we have to bring the community back to the center of this. And everything we've gone through COVID only exacerbates that, yes, the government is important, but at some point, systems change or any change ultimately has to have the ownership of the community. And what worries me is we veered so much in our sector to align with the government, work with the government, that when the government system breaks down, you've really got the community who's needing to take ownership, obviously for themselves, but also for others. And so how do you link that philanthropy to build that community ownership? I do feel systems change needs to take a bit more of a pivot, and we've aligned ourselves far too much with engaging with the government solely.
Okay, that's so we've got a lot of great questions. I have to apologize for that we're not going to have enough time to get to them, but I want to give Iqbal, there was a question there, if you saw it, about climate change. I saw it a minute ago. I'm having a little bit of difficulty navigating this.
I see it. I think Tim, it says climate change system is not attracting donors despite clear measures, perhaps since the system is boundaryless. Our government system measurement is the challenge. Do you agree? If not, why? Is that the one?
Yeah, could you give just a 60-second answer to that? I know it deserves much more, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like I just want to build up on what Neera said to answer this question. I think you know, the other lesson I think from the COVID crisis that I want people to take, even though you know it seems like endless and it seems like you know the entire world's resources have been pointed to COVID, is that I think we must realize that the COVID crisis has a scientific end to it. And the scientific end comes as soon as the vaccine is developed, and you know there is a deadline and an end line to this crisis. On the other hand, the crisis of poverty and climate change are the real challenges that we have been grappling with, you know, in terms of poverty for decades and decades, and in terms of climate change for the last decade. And I think those are the generational fights that we have to fight. So I hope that, you know, we don't allocate way too many resources, because I think what we have learned is that nature has a way of getting back at us. And once you hit a tipping point, whether it is, you know, community infections in the case of COVID, or it is a particular temperature level in the case of climate, or a particular percentage of people below poverty, you know, things are much harder to turn back. And so I think donors and doers have to realize that those are the existential challenges. Those have not changed because of COVID, on to Neera's points, and we have to be prepared to fight them with system level change.
Great, thank you. Okay, we only have about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to give each of the panelists about 90 seconds to answer a question. So the first for James and then Neera, the same question. If you offer one piece of advice to doers who support systems change on how best to approach donors or attract the needed funding support, what would it be?
Well, I think that what I say again is to really assess what is the risk-taking appetite of that donor, or the people you're approaching, right? And very much if both doers and donors use that chart, that J-curve chart, right, and point out, okay, where am I on that chart? Am I a early stage, high risk, or am I a late stage, right? Then the doers can recognize, oh, if I'm looking for system change money, and you're pointing to the right side of that chart, let me not waste my time, and resources, to try and to raise that money. Too often today, I think, people really don't think of it. They always think of a dollar from the government, a government institution is the same as a dollar from private capital. And that's my main point here, is that actually private capital is actually much more flexible, right? And if you ever apply to USAID or World Bank or any of the institutions, you'll know it comes with so many conditionality, which is around stripping out the risk, right? It's about risk aversity, kind of reducing the risk to that age, funding, the agent, right? Because they are agents to the real capital.
Yeah. Great point. Neera, same question. 60 seconds. Sorry.
Yeah, no, of course. So I think doers need to take donors on a learning journey, and think about a long-term horizon. Think about holding their hand, exposing them to the work you're doing, exposing them to the challenges, and begin to create a space where they trust you and you trust them. And from that will come this ability to course correct and to adapt. So I think to change our mindset, and that we're both on a learning journey to ultimately really change lives and have an impact. I think intent is all there. And so really holding hands and moving together, virtually or in reality, will help.
And thank you, Neera. And now for Rukmini and Iqbal, the question for you is, if a donor comes to you and says, how can I, as a donor, be a better funder of systems change impact, what are one or two things you would say to them? Again, just in 60 seconds. Sorry, we're running out of time. Rukmini, can you go first, please?
So I would say there are systems at many levels. There is a local level, there is an intermediary level, there could be a national level. And so between the donor and the doer, you've got to figure out what's your best comparative advantage on the ground, in the air. The second, I think, is things that bring two parties together is how do you view the logic of how you think this thing is going to change. Call it theory of change, call it whatever you will. And I think really going through with each other, looking at, you don't have to agree, but you have to respect that this is the path I'm going to try, and you have to like thrillers if you're in this business, because it is a thrilling journey with ups and downs.
Great. And Iqbal, same question.
Just when they are needed.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of that. I don't know if the audience did.
Oh, sorry, Tim. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I said that I would just tell donors that it's less about the amount of money and it is more about how you spend that money. And I think being, trusting, building long-term partnerships and then being nimble and flexible with those partners on how they spend the money to effect system-level change is extremely important, because those 5 points that I raised just tells you how complex system-level change is. And so allowing the doers to be flexible and to have the available resources to pivot as and when the change happens, because change is not going to, system-level change does not happen in a linear fashion, is the most important thing. Thank you.
Great. Well, there was some great words of wisdom from this terrific panel. It doesn't surprise me. So thank you all. And I'd like to thank the audience too for joining us today. We'll be sending out a thank you, which will include a link to our session so you can listen to the recording. And yeah, we're out of time. So let me just wrap up and say that I'm grateful to you, the panelists, grateful to you, the audience, for joining us, grateful to AVPN for hosting this virtual conference, which I think so far, at least from where I can see, has been very successful. So thank you, AVPN. Bye, everyone. Stay safe. Make it a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you to Tim and our wonderful panel of speakers. Such great insights, and judging from the comments in the Q&A board, our audience thought so as well. We had over 600 people tune in to this session. Thank you all for being with us this morning. All good things must come to an end, and we have come to the end of our session. This session was made possible with the generous support of our lead partners, Chandler Foundation, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Ethan Price Foundation. The next session is taking place at 12 p.m. Singapore time. The session is Catalyzing Philanthropy Through Innovative Approaches. Do tune in and learn from our experienced speakers. If you're an AVPN member or a policy ticket holder, take full advantage of the AVPN connector to maximize your networking opportunities. Do check out the AVPN Hub as well and explore our thematic lounges. Connecting and hubbing, that is the power of the AVPN network. As we close, please complete a session survey on your way out. It has just 4 questions and will take 30 seconds. The survey will pop up on your screen after this. We hope this has been a meaningful time for you. Remember, systemic challenges require systemic answers. Systemic answers require systemic thinking. Systemic thinking leads to systemic beings. Let us all aspire to be systemic beings and change the world. Have a compelling day at the AVPN virtual conference and grab hold of the last 2 days. May the bandwidth be with you.